In a glass-walled boardroom overlooking Silicon Valley, a 67-year-old engineer was about to be quietly erased. What started as a routine walk into work on the company's 10-year anniversary took a shocking turn when he came face to face with a room full of executives and a termination folder with his name on it. Stanley Hoffman wasn't your typical retiree-in-waiting. For over 4 decades, he had architected some of the most groundbreaking predictive algorithms in the tech world, known for his unwavering ethics, quiet brilliance, and a stubborn refusal to commodify innovation. When he discovered that the 2.8 billion algorithm he built was being stripped of his name and handed to a less principled successor, he had no idea he was walking into a reckoning. Stanley made a choice that would lead to an industry earthquake, licensing the very algorithm they hoarded for just $1 to their 12 fiercest competitors. What began as corporate betrayal would become an unstoppable act of principled rebellion. The AI elite of Silicon Valley would never be the same after Stanley rewrote the rules of innovation by proving that power doesn't come from owning code, but from choosing how it's shared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. When I walked into the office that morning, no one greeted me, not even Eric, who used to bring me coffee every Friday. After a big win, the hallway lights were dimmer than usual. The screen in the lobby still flashed 10 years of Titan leading the market with precision. My name wasn't on the banner. It never had been, but today, it felt deliberate. I paused in the middle of the lobby, the hum of the LED screen washing over me. Titan had hit its 10-year mark, 10 years of success, global dominance, predictive perfection, 10 years of my code, humming beneath every decision that built this empire. Stanley had been here since day one when the servers were in the back of a storage closet, when we called it Project Atlas, before marketing stepped in and renamed it Titan, and yet now as employees gathered around trays of catered pastries and branded cupcakes, it felt like he was just another face in the hallway. No eye contact, no head nods, just movement around him like he'd already disappeared, and no one had noticed. He tried to shake it off. Maybe it was nerves, maybe they were saving the real celebration for later. He reached his floor, expecting the usual buzz near the project team space. Instead, the glass doors were shut, the lights inside dim. His badge still worked, but barely anyone was there. Notification blinked on his phone. Titan, at 10 live remarks hall and 9:30 in the morning. It was already 9:20 in the morning. He walked quickly across the main corridor, the sound of his shoes clicking like a stranger's. As he stepped into the back of the auditorium, he saw the banners stretched across the stage celebrating a decade of disruption, and in the center of the stage, smiling behind the podium, was Natalie, who he mentored 5 years ago, Natalie, who once cried in his office after failing her first deployment, Natalie, who once said, "If I can be even 10% of who you are, Stanley, I'll make it." Now she was delivering the opening speech. He stood in the dark corner of the room, arms folded, trying to understand what he was looking at. No one mentioned he'd been replaced. No one told him anything. And for the first time in a decade, he realized he wasn't just being left out. He was being erased. The applause was still echoing in his ears as he stepped away from the auditorium's back door. He didn't know where to go, so he let his feet take him anywhere. But there, somewhere, quiet, somewhere that didn't smell like staged celebration and polished betrayal, he ended up in the South Wing elevator, pressing the button to the 17th floor. Out of habit, that's where his real office had been before they moved. Project leadership to a shared workspace on 12. Another way of saying you're being phased out without the headline. As the elevator opened, a new calendar alert buzzed on his phone. The title read, Executive Review, 17th Floor Conference, 10 now. Sharp, mandatory. It was already 9:57 in the morning. No explanation, no prior notice, no prep, just an order. He stepped out. The hallway was silent. Even the motion sensor lights took a second to flicker on. At the end of the corridor sat the room. He knew too well the walls had always been an unremarkable beige, a color that looked like it had been chosen to erase emotion, When he opened the door, 3 people were waiting. Not one of them smiled. Carla from HR sat stiffly, a folder already open in front of her. Next to her, a legal counsel he didn't recognize at the head of the table in his signature navy suit and tight jawline was Victor Dane, Chief Operating Officer. Stanley hadn't seen Victor in weeks. He never bothered with engineering discussions. He had famously once said, "I don't need to understand code to know it's too expensive." Now he was presiding over the end of Stanley's career, like it was a budget meeting. He didn't offer a seat. He just gestured to the chair opposite him and said, "Let's begin." Carla cleared her throat and began reading from a page. Stanley was not allowed to touch effective immediately. The role of lead architect has been dissolved under structural realignment. Your contributions are appreciated. That was it. One sentence for 10 years of blood, brain, and silence. No review, no feedback, no mention of Titan. Stanley looked at Victor. He didn't blink, just folded his hands and said, "This isn't personal. Stanley, the company is evolving. It's time to shift our resources to more open source innovation." Stanley's heart stilled. Open source. That was Victor's fight for years, trying to convince the board to strip Titan's proprietary encryption and unlock its scalability. Stanley had pushed back, fought fight security, for accountability, for boundaries, and now, Victor had won by removing the last person who could say no. He wasn't just erasing Stanley, he was claiming the system. Stanley should have screamed. He should have thrown that beige folder across the room, but he didn't. He stood up slowly. No handshake, no words. He picked up the pen from the table, wrote, "Received," on the page, and walked out. Not a single person stopped him. As he rode the elevator back down, he looked at his reflection in the steel doors. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dry. No tears would fall. Not for them. Outside, the wind picked up. A storm was forecasted that afternoon. Good. Let it come, because something had already shifted inside him. They thought they just signed a termination. They had no idea they had just started a countdown. The walk from the building to the parking garage felt unreal. Stanley kept checking badge, as if part of him believed this had been a mistake, and he'd still be let back in. But the gate didn't buzz anymore. His access had already been shut off. He sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes, hands still on the steering wheel, not knowing where to go, not ready to drive home, not ready to answer questions. He hadn't even told Julie what today was supposed to be Titan's 10-year anniversary. He started the engine. The dashboard clock blinked. 11:06 in the morning. By 11:45 he was back in his apartment, shoes kicked off, blazer crumpled on the couch. He moved on instinct, unpacking his laptop, plugging into the docking station and opening the terminal window. Old habits. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe a sense of closure, maybe the last glimpse of something he'd built. He wasn't going to sabotage anything that was never his way. He just wanted to disconnect cleanly. A digital goodbye. Opened the system admin panel for his encrypted workspace, still active. He blinked. Surely they had revoked access by now. Revoking credentials was standard protocol, but everything looked normal. No lockouts, no password resets. His hands hovered over the keyboard, stiff. He clicked deeper. Titan's Core 8 authentication protocol, the same one he had written nearly a decade ago, layered in 3 levels of encryption, rotated every 30 days. It required a token that only he could generate, and there it was in his personal security vault, the master encryption key, the one thing he'd kept separate from company infrastructure, the one thing they couldn't take away, because they didn't know it existed. He'd built it as a failsafe back when the company was 3 people in a garage, when trust mattered more than legal departments, when handshakes meant something. Now, it was the last piece of himself that Titan couldn't erase. Stanley stared at the screen for a long time. The key was elegant, 20 of 48 bits of pure mathematical poetry that unlocked the heart of a $2.8 billion empire. Without it, Titan was just another predictive analytics platform. With it, you could revolutionize any industry overnight. They'd just fired the only person who held it. The idea came slowly at first, just a whisper of possibility. What if he didn't destroy anything? What if he simply shared what he'd built? What if he gave other companies the same advantage? Titan had hoarded for a decade, not as sabotage, but as justice reminder that innovation belonged to innovators, not corporate suits who viewed code as commodity. He opened a new document and began typing license agreement for Titan core algorithm, proprietary rights, retained by Stanley Hoffman, available for commercial use under standard terms, licensing fee $10 per organization. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. $1. It was almost insulting, but it wasn't about money, it was about watching Victor's empire crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. Stanley spent the rest of the afternoon researching Titan's biggest competitor. Apex Dynamics had been trying to break into predictive modeling for years. Quantum Solutions was hemorrhaging talent to bigger firms. Neural Networks Unlimited had the resources, but lacked the breakthrough technology they all needed. What Stanley had built, and now they could have it for the price of a coffee by evening. He'd drafted 12 identical contracts, each one a small controlled explosion that would detonate Victor's monopoly. He wasn't stealing, he wasn't hacking, he was simply choosing where to place his loyalty, and after 10 years of building something beautiful, only to watch it corrupted by greed, his loyalty no longer lived in that glass tower downtown. Julie called around 7, asking how the anniversary celebration went. Stanley looked at the contracts spread across his desk, waiting for signatures, waiting to reshape an entire industry. It was illuminating. He told her, "Think I'm ready for a new chapter." She heard something in his voice, a quiet determination that made her smile. "Good for you, Dad. The tech world doesn't deserve you anyway." After she hung up, Stanley printed the 12 contracts, signed each one with a fountain pen he'd received as a gift for Titan's first $1 million deal. Then he walked to his study, opened his laptop and began composing 12 carefully crafted emails to 12 very surprised CEOs. By midnight, the first phase of his quiet revolution would be complete. Stanley sent the first email at 11:47 p.m. to Caleb Morrison, CEO Pathways, a scrappy AI startup that had been clawing for market share against the industry giants. The subject line was simple: proposal for collaboration. Stanley attached the licensing agreement and wrote a brief note. "Caleb, you've been building impressive solutions with limited resources, something that might change that for you. Review the attached and let me know if you're interested. Total licensing fee $1 per." The attached agreement. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Then he composed 11 more identical messages, each one carefully researched, each recipient chosen for maximum impact on Titan's market dominance. Apex Dynamics had the distribution network, Quantum Solutions had the client relationships, Neural Networks Unlimited had the capital. They all had pieces of the puzzle, but none had the core algorithm that made Titan untouchable until now. By the next morning, Stanley's phone was buzzing with responses. The first was from Caleb, sent at 3:22 a.m. "Stanley, this has to be a mistake or a trap. Nobody licenses enterprise-grade AI for $1, especially not the Titan algorithm. Assuming this is legitimate, and assuming you actually hold the rights, my legal team will need to verify everything, but if this is real, you just changed the game. Call me." Stanley smiled as he read the message. Caleb was smart enough to be suspicious, but desperate enough to hope it was real. That was exactly the combination Stanley needed. He made coffee and settled in his home office to field the inevitable flood of confused, excited, and suspicious responses from CEOs who couldn't believe what they were seeing. The second response came from Elena Vasquez at Apex Dynamics. "Stanley, I've been following your work for years. The Titan algorithm is legendary in our industry, but I have to ask, why are you doing this? And why $1? This feels too good to be true, but if it's legitimate, we're absolutely interested. We've been trying to build something comparable for 3 years. This would save us millions in development costs." By 10 a.m., Stanley had responses from 8 of the 12 companies. 4 were suspicious, but interested. 3 were ready to sign immediately. 1 demanded a video call to verify Stanley's identity before proceeding. Stanley scheduled calls with the serious prospects and prepared to explain his very simple terms: access to the complete Titan core algorithm, including documentation, implementation guides, and ongoing support for exactly $1 per organization. The first video call was with Caleb, who appeared on screen looking like he hadn't slept in days. Stanley, I have to ask the obvious question. Is this revenge against your former employer? Stanley considered the question carefully. This isn't about revenge, Caleb, it's about ensuring that innovation serves innovators. Not just corporate shareholders. Titan was built to solve problems, not to create monopolies. If other companies can use it to compete and innovate, that's how it should be. Caleb leaned back in his chair. And the $1 fee, that's not exactly market rate for enterprise software. Stanley smiled. The value isn't in the price, Caleb, it's in what you build with it. Titan's algorithm is just a foundation, matters is what you construct on top of it. I'm betting you'll build something better than they ever imagined. By the end of the day, Stanley had signed agreements with 5 companies. Caleb's neural pathways was first followed by Apex Dynamics, Quantum Solutions, Radian Analytics and Breakthrough A. Each company wired exactly $1 to Stanley's account and received complete access to the algorithm that had powered Titan's decade of dominance. Stanley spent the evening setting up secure repositories for each licensee, ensuring they had everything they needed. A documentation code sample, implementation guides, and his personal contact information. For technical support, he worked methodically, almost meditative, as he watched Victor's empire begin to crack from the foundation up. As he uploaded the final repository, Stanley thought about Natalie delivering her speech about a decade of disruption. She had no idea how disrupted things were about to become by tomorrow morning. 5 of Titan's biggest competitors would have access to their most guarded secret, and Stanley would still have 7 more contracts to fulfill. The revolution had begun not with violence or sabotage but with $1 transactions and careful legal documents. Victor wanted open-source innovation. Now he was going to get more innovation than he could handle from every direction at once. And Stanley would watch it all unfold from the quiet comfort of his home office, where loyalty and integrity still met something. Linda Chen arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., the way she always did when crisis demanded her attention. The email from their market intelligence team had arrived at 4:17 a.m., with the subject line "Urgent Competitive Analysis." Anomalies detected. She'd read it 3 times in her Tesla before walking into the building. Each reading making less sense than the last breakthrough. AI had somehow deployed a predictive model that was outperforming Titan by 12% in real time. Analytics. Apex Dynamics had launched a client acquisition algorithm that was poaching Titan's enterprise customer and neural pathways. A company Linda barely considered competition had announced a partnership with 3 Fortune 500 companies overnight, using what their press release called revolutionary predictive intelligence. The conference room on the 18th floor was already full when Linda walked in. Sat at the head of the table, his navy suit wrinkled from an all-nighter. Ethan looked like he'd been crying or maybe just hadn't slept. Charlotte from legal had a stack of papers in front of her and kept checking her phone every 30 seconds. The market intelligence team had prepared a presentation, but Linda could see from their faces they didn't understand what they were presenting. "Show me the numbers," Linda said without sitting down. The lead analyst clicked through slides that made no sense. Breakthrough AI's algorithm was processing data patterns that should have taken months to develop. Apex Dynamics was predicting market fluctuations with accuracy rates that Titan had spent years perfecting. Neural pathways was somehow running predictive models that looked exactly like Titan's internal benchmarks. "How is this possible?" Victor asked the question. Linda was afraid to voice. "The companies don't have our resources, our talent, our infrastructure. How are they suddenly competing at our level?" The analyst cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we think they might have access to similar algorithms. The processing patterns, the prediction accuracy, the deployment speed. It's all consistent with Titan-level technology." Linda felt something cold settle in her stomach. "That's impossible. Our algorithm is proprietary. It's encrypted. It's protected by 17 different security protocols." Charlotte looked up from her phone. "Unless someone with access decided to share it." The room went silent. Victor's jaw tightened. "You're suggesting internal sabotage." "I'm suggesting we consider all possibilities," Charlotte said carefully. Our stock price dropped 8% yesterday. Our clients are asking questions. And 3 more competitors announced Titan-level capabilities this morning. Isn't coincidence, this is systematic. Linda walked to the window overlooking Silicon Valley somewhere out there. Companies were using her algorithm against her, and she had no idea how. Get me a list of everyone with level 5 access to Titan's core systems. Victor ordered. Cross-reference it with anyone who's left the company in the past 6 months. Anyone with grudges. Anyone with access. Ethan raised his hand tentatively. What about Stanley? He was the original architect. He would know every backdoor, every weakness. Linda turned from the window. Stanley was terminated 3 days ago. Access was revoked immediately. Charlotte cleared her throat. Actually, his access was supposed to be revoked. The termination was handled quickly, and there might have been oversights in the security protocol. Victor's face went red. Are you telling me Stanley Hoffman still has access to our system? I'm saying we should verify that he doesn't, Charlotte replied. Linda felt the cold in her stomach spread to her chest. Stanley, the quiet, methodical man who'd built Titan from nothing. Stanley who'd argued with Victor about open-source innovation. Stanley who'd walked out of that conference room without saying a word by noon. The security audit confirmed what Linda already knew. Stanley's credentials were still active. His encryption keys were still valid. His administrative access was still functional. He'd been terminated but not digitally erased. And in the 3 days since his firing, competitors had suddenly gained access to Titan-level technology. Get him on the phone, Victor ordered. Offer him whatever it takes to fix this. Linda shook her head. You think he's going to help us after we fired him? Victor stood up, pacing behind his chair. He built this company, he would destroy it. He's too invested, too proud. Charlotte looked up from her laptop. Actually, Victor, I think you might be wrong about that. She turned her screen around, showing them a news alert. Neural Pathways announces breakthrough in predictive analytics. Stock jumps 34% in morning trading. Article included quotes from Caleb Morrison, praising the revolutionary algorithm that would level the playing field in AI competition. Linda read the quotes twice before understanding what she was seeing. He's not destroying the company, she said quietly. He's destroying our monopoly. Victor's pacing. What's the difference? Linda looked at the faces around the table. Ethan confused and overwhelmed. Charlotte worried but not surprised. The market intelligence team still trying to understand what they were analyzing. The difference, Victor, is that destruction implies chaos. Stanley's doing something much worse. He's creating order, just not the kind that benefits us. Her phone buzzed with another alert. Meridian Analytics reports record quarterly projections. Following AI breakthrough. Linda didn't need to read the article to know what it would say. By 3 p.m., the situation had escalated beyond crisis into catastrophe. Quantum Solutions had announced a partnership with 2 of Titan's biggest clients. Apex Dynamics had hired 3 of Titan's former employees, and Breakthrough AI was being courted by investors who'd previously been exclusive to Titan. Linda called an emergency board meeting for 5 p.m., but she already knew what she was going to tell them. They weren't facing a security breach or corporate espionage. They were facing something much more dangerous. They were facing a man who'd built their empire and decided to share it with everyone else. Stanley wasn't stealing their algorithm. He was giving it away, and there was no legal precedent, no security protocol, no corporate strategy that could stop a man from licensing his own creation. As the sun set over Silicon Valley, Linda stood in her office looking out at the lights of dozens of companies that were now her equal instead of her competitors. For the first time in 10 years, Titan wasn't the only game in town, and the man responsible was sitting somewhere in the valley, probably watching the news, probably smiling, probably planning his next move. Victor knocked on her door. The board meeting is starting. Nodded, but didn't turn around. Do you know what's ironic, Victor? We fired Stanley because you said we needed to move toward open source innovation. Victor shifted uncomfortably. This isn't what I meant. Linda finally turned to face him. No, Victor. This is exactly what you meant. You just never imagined it wouldn't be our choice. Charlotte sat in her car outside Stanley's apartment complex for 20 minutes before working up the courage to walk to his door. She'd driven there straight from the office, after watching Linda and Victor spend 6 hours in increasingly desperate phone call with lawyers, investors and board members, trying to find some way to put the genie back in the bottle. She'd worked with Stanley for 8 years. Watched him build Titan from a promising concept into a revolutionary platform that changed entire industries. She'd also watched him grow quieter, more isolated, as the company grew larger, more corporate, more willing to treat people as replaceable components. Charlotte had climbed the corporate ladder by being careful, diplomatic, strategic, but Stanley had always been her moral compass. Now he'd disappeared from the company without explanation. Suddenly their biggest competitors had access to Titan-level technology. Charlotte wasn't a fool, she knew exactly what had happened. She just didn't know if she should stop it or help it along. Stanley answered the door in jeans and a Stanford t-shirt, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him in years. "Charlotte, I wondered when you'd show up." She followed him into his apartment, noting the laptop open on the dining table, the stack of legal documents, the calm, organized atmosphere of someone executing a carefully planned strategy. "Stanley, what are you doing?" she asked, though she already knew. Poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "I'm licensing my algorithm to companies that will actually innovate with it instead of hoarding it for market domination." Charlotte sat down across from him. "You're destroying Titan." Stanley shook his head. "I'm destroying Titan's monopoly. There's difference. Linda and Victor are panicking. The stock price is dropping. Clients are asking questions. The board is talking about emergency restructuring." Stanley nodded. "Good. Maybe they'll learn something about treating people like human beings instead of disposable resources." Charlotte stared at him, trying to reconcile this calm, methodical man with the Stanley. She thought she knew how many companies. She asked. 12. So far, with 3 more meetings scheduled for next week. Charlotte did the math. In her head, 12 companies, with access to Titan's core algorithm. 12 new competitors, a market that Titan had dominated for a decade. "Stanley, this will destroy everything we built." "Everything we built." Charlotte, or everything they stole? Stanley leaned back in his chair. "I spent 10 years perfecting that algorithm, 10 years of 16-hour days, missed dinners, failed relationship, complete dedication to building something beautiful, and they fired me because Victor decided he wanted more control over open source innovation. Well, now he's got it." Charlotte felt torn between loyalty to Stanley and fear for her own career. She'd worked too hard to get where she was to watch it all collapse because of one man's revenge. There has to be another way. "Stanley, something that doesn't hurt innocent people." Stanley smiled sadly. "Charlotte, everyone at that company participated in erasing me from Titan's history. Even you. That's not fair. I didn't know about the termination until it was done." Stanley nodded. "And what did you do when you found out?" "You called the lawyers to see if there were grounds for wrongful termination. You checked with HR to see if proper procedures were followed. You made sure the company was protected, but you never called me." Charlotte realized he right. She'd been more concerned about protecting Titan than supporting her friend. "I'm sorry, Stanley. I should have reached out sooner." Stanley reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "It's not about apologies, Charlotte. It's about choices, and I'm choosing to ensure my life's work serves innovation instead of corporate greed." Meanwhile, across town, Ethan was sitting in Stanley's old office, trying to understand Titan's codebase without any guidance from its creator. The algorithm was elegant, beautiful, and completely incomprehensible without Stanley's documentation. Ethan had been hired because he was brilliant, but he'd never worked on anything this complex, this interconnected. Every time he thought he understood one component, he'd discover it was connected to 17 other systems, each one dependent on the others in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Stanley had built Titan like a symphony, every note precisely placed, Every harmony carefully crafted, and Ethan was trying to conduct it with only half the sheet music. His phone rang. It was Victor. Ethan, I need you to find a way to block competitor access to our algorithm. Ethan stared at his computer screen, showing thousands of lines of code he barely understood. Victor, I'm still trying to figure out how our own algorithm works. I don't know how they're accessing it or how to stop them. Then figure it out, that's what we're paying you for. Victor hung up, leaving Ethan alone with an impossible task. Stanley had spent a decade building Titan, and Ethan was supposed to understand it in a week. Then prevent 12 other companies from using it. The weight of the responsibility was crushing. Charlotte called Stanley that evening. The board meeting was a disaster. They're talking about hiring a crisis management firm, bringing in external consultants, maybe even selling the company. Stanley was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this, Charlotte, but this was always going to happen. Eventually. Victor's vision of corporate control was unsustainable. What do you mean? Stanley explained how Victor had been pushing for months to strip Titan's proprietary protections, release it as open-source technology. He wanted to control the entire market by making Titan the standard platform, but he wanted to do it on his terms with his oversight, instead of real innovation. So you did it for him, Charlotte said, understanding Stanley's strategy. Exactly. I gave him the open-source innovation. He wanted just not the way he imagined it. Now instead of Titan controlling the market controls itself through genuine competition and innovation. Charlotte hung up the phone and sat in her kitchen staring at her reflection in the dark window. She could report Stanley's actions to the authorities, try to stop the licensing agreements, protect the company that employed her, or she could do nothing and watch Victor's empire crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. By midnight, she'd made her choice. She opened her laptop and began drafting her resignation letter. Effective. Immediately she was done being complicit in a system that valued control over people. If Stanley could walk away from everything he'd built to preserve his integrity, Charlotte could do the same. The unraveling had begun, and it was spreading faster than anyone at Titan had imagined. Quiet rebellion was becoming a revolution, and the corporate empire built on his algorithm was discovering that empires built on exploitation rarely survive. Contact with justice. Victor assembled his crisis team at 7 a.m. in the executive conference room. The walls were lined with whiteboards covered in organizational charts, competitor analysis, and what looked like a military campaign strategy. Linda sat at one end of the table surrounded by laptops, tablets, and enough coffee cups to fuel a small startup. We need to fight back, Victor announced to the room, full of lawyers, security experts and new hired consultants. Stanley Hoffman has declared war on this company, and we're going to respond accordingly. The head of cybersecurity, a woman named Janet, who'd been brought in, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. From a government contractor raised her hand. Sir, we need to clarify something. Stanley isn't hacking our systems. He's legally licensing his own intellectual property. Victor's jaw tightened. That algorithm was developed using company resources, company infrastructure. It belongs to Titan, not to some disgruntled former employee. The legal counsel shook his head. Actually, Victor, the intellectual property agreements from Stanley's original contract are ambiguous at best. He retained certain rights to his foundational work. Linda looked up from her laptop. How ambiguous? The lawyer consulted his notes. Ambiguous enough that a court battle would take years and cost millions with no guarantee we'd win. Victor slammed his hand on the table. Then we don't go to court. We go around it. Janet, what would it take to neutralize Stanley's access to our systems? Janet looked uncomfortable. Sir, he's not accessing our systems. He's distributing his own code from his own servers to companies that are legally licensing it from him. There's nothing to neutralize. Victor stared at her. There has to be something. Cyber warfare, digital sabotage, economic espionage, whatever it takes. Victor, Linda said quietly. We can't fight this with illegal tactics. Victor turned on her. Illegal according to who we're talking about. Industrial sabotage, corporate espionage, theft of proprietary technology. The room fell silent, everyone understanding that Victor had crossed a line from crisis management into something much darker. The cybersecurity consultant packed up her laptop. Mr. Dane, I can't be part of any discussion involving illegal activities. My contract specifically prohibits it. She left the room, followed by two of the other consultants, leaving Victor, Linda, and the remaining legal team to contemplate increasingly desperate options. By noon, Victor had shifted tactics. If we can't stop Stanley legally, and we can't stop him technically, then we stop him financially. He'd hired a private investigation firm to examine Stanley's assets, his licensing agreements, his business relationships, looking for any leverage they could use. He's collecting $1 per license, the investigator reported. Total revenue so far is $15. He's not doing this for money, he's doing it for revenge, which makes him much more dangerous. Leaned forward. Everyone has a price. Find his. Meanwhile, Stanley was in his home office responding to his 17th inquiry about the Titan algorithm, this one from a startup in Singapore that specialized in financial modeling. The global reach of his quiet revolution was exceeding even his own expectations. Companies from 12 countries had reached out in the past week. His phone rang. It was Julie. Dad, are you watching the news? Stanley looked up from his laptop to see a breaking news alert on his second monitor. Titan stock continues slide as competitors gain ground. CEO Linda Chen emergency investor meeting. Stanley smiled. I'm watching it now. The reporter mentioned you by name. Dad, they're saying you're behind the competitive intelligence leaks. Stanley frowned. They're calling it intelligence leaks. Julie read, from what sounded like a news website. Former Titan architect Stanley Hoffman, suspected of industrial espionage, following mysterious competitor advantages. Stanley felt anger building in his chest for the first time since his termination. They're framing this as theft, he told Julie, when what I'm doing is perfectly legal licensing my own work to company that will innovate with it. Julie was quiet for a moment. Dad, maybe you should get a lawyer. That afternoon, Stanley received a registered letter from Titan's legal department, demanding he cease all licensing activities and surrender any proprietary information related to Titan's algorithm. Letter threatened civil and criminal prosecution for theft of trade secrets, violation of intellectual property rights, and industrial espionage. Stanley called Charlotte, who answered on the first ring. Stanley, I'm so sorry about the legal threat. Victor's lost his mind. He's talking about hire private investigators, criminal prosecutors, federal cybersecurity agencies. Stanley was quiet, processing the escalation. Charlotte, they can't prosecute me for licensing my own algorithm. They're going to try. Stanley, Victor's convinced the board that you're a threat to national economic security, that your actions constitute economic terrorism. He's building a case that Titan's algorithm is critical infrastructure, and you're sabotaging it. Stanley realized Victor had moved beyond corporate retaliation into something approaching persecution. That evening, Stanley sat in his study reviewing his original employment contract, the intellectual property agreements, the founding documents of Project Atlas, everything he'd signed when Titan was just 3 people with a revolutionary idea. The contracts were indeed ambiguous, but they were ambiguous in his favor. Not Titan's. He called his own lawyer, woman named Patricia, who'd handled his divorce 5 years earlier. Patricia, I need you to review some intellectual property law. He explained the situation, the licensing agreements, Victor's threats of prosecution. Patricia was quiet for a long time. Stanley, this is bigger than intellectual property law. This is about corporate power, and what happens when someone challenges it. You're not just fighting Titan, you're fighting the entire system that allows companies like Titan to exist. Stanley nodded. I understand that, Patricia, but I'm not backing down. then we need to be prepared for total war because that's what this is going to become. Patricia paused. Stanley, they're going to try to destroy you personally, professionally, financially. Are you ready for that? Stanley looked at his laptop screen, showing emails from 3 more companies, requesting licensing agreements. Patricia, I've already been destroyed. They fired me, erased me from the company I built, treated me like a disposable resource. What more can they take? Patricia's voice was grim. Stanley, they can take everything else. Your reputation, your freedom, your future. They can make sure you never work in tech again. Stan considered this for a moment, then opened another licensing email, this one, from a company in Germany. Then I guess I better make sure as many companies as possible have access to the algorithm before they shut me down. He began typing his response. Offer accepted, licensing fee, $1 wire transfer details, attached. Welcome to the revolution. Victor's retaliation plan was escalating from corporate crisis management to personal warfare, but Stanley's revolution was spreading faster than Victor could contain it. The question was no longer whether Titan would survive. Stanley's rebellion's question was whether Stanley would survive. Victor's retaliation. Linda stood outside Stanley's apartment at 8 p.m., holding a briefcase that contained what she hoped would end the war. Victor had started. The private investigators had provided Stanley's address, his daily routines, his coffee shop preferences, everything except a strategy for convincing him to save the company. He'd spent 3 weeks systematically dismantling. She'd left Victor at the office, surrounded by crisis management consultants and emergency board members, all of them shouting about legal strategies, media campaigns, damage control, none of them understanding that Stanley wasn't motivated by money or fear or corporate pressure. He was motivated by something much more dangerous: principle. Stanley answered the door, looking unsurprised to see her. Linda, I wondered when you'd come. She followed him into his living room, noting the calm, organized atmosphere, the laptop displaying emails from companies around the world, the quiet confidence of someone who held all the cards. Stanley, we need to talk, she said, setting the briefcase on his coffee table. Titan is hemorrhaging clients. Stock price has dropped 40% in 2 weeks. The board is demanding answers. Stanley nodded. And what answers are you giving them? Linda opened the briefcase, revealing contracts, stock options, financial documents. I'm offering you something better than revenge. Stanley, I'm offering you control. She spread the papers across his table. Chief Technology Officer, reporting directly to me, full autonomy over all AI development. 40% equity stake in the company. Stanley examined documents without touching them. You're offering me control of the company that fired me 3 weeks ago. Linda leaned forward. Stanley, we made a mistake. Victor made a mistake. The board realizes now that we need you. We've always needed you, but we were too proud to admit it. And now you're not too proud. Stanley asked. Linda felt heat rise in her cheeks. Stanley, we're facing an existential crisis. 12 companies have your algorithm. 17 more have inquired. Our market dominance is disappearing daily. We need you to help us regain competitive advantage. Stanley stood up and walked to his window, overlooking Silicon Valley. Linda, do you know what I've been doing for the past 3 weeks? She followed his gaze. Destroying our business model. Stanley shook his head. I've been watching innovation happen, real innovation. Not corporate hoarding, but genuine competition. He turned back. Our neural pathways used my algorithm to develop a healthcare prediction system that's saving lives. Apex Dynamics created an environmental monitoring platform that's tracking climate change breakthrough. AI built an educational system that's personalizing learning for disabled students. Linda felt her prepared arguments crumbling. That's wonderful, Stanley, but Titan built the foundation for all of that. Our research, our investment, our infrastructure. Stanley smiled sadly. Titan built a monopoly. Linda, those companies built solutions. So you won't consider our offer? Linda asked, though she already knew the answer. Stanley picked up the contracts and handed them back to her. Linda, I spent 10 years building something beautiful and watching Victor turn it into a weapon for market domination. I'm not going to help him do it again. Linda felt desperation building in her chest. Stanley, you don't help us, Titan will collapse completely, thousands of jobs will be lost, investors will lose billions. The entire AI industry will be destabilized. Stanley sat back down across from her. Linda, the AI industry is being stabilized. It's just not being stabilized around Titan. You built the company, Stanley. You can't just watch it die. Linda's voice cracked. Stanley leaned forward. Linda, I didn't build a company, I built an algorithm. Titan became something else entirely, something that valued control over innovation, profit over people, market domination over genuine progress. Gathered the contracts back into her briefcase. The board won't accept this. Stanley, they'll fight you in court. They'll destroy your reputation. They'll make sure you never work in tech again. Stanley's expression didn't change. They already tried to destroy me, Linda. They fired me, erased me from Titan's history, treated me like a disposable resource. That was Victor's decision, not mine. Linda said. Stanley nodded. And what did you do when you found out about Victor's decision? Did you fight for me? Did you question the wisdom of firing the architect of your most valuable asset? Did you even call to say goodbye? Linda realized she hadn't. She'd been focused on damage control, on protecting the company, on managing the crisis, not on the human cost of Victor's decision. I'm sorry, Stanley, I should have handled it differently. Stanley stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. Apologies don't change decisions, Linda, and decisions reveal character. As Linda walked back to her car, she felt the weight of Stanley's rejection, settling over her like a shroud. The briefcase felt heavier now, filled with contracts that represented Titan's last desperate attempt to maintain control. Stanley had built their empire, and now he was choosing to watch it crumble rather than save it. She called Victor from her car. He said no. Victor's voice was sharp. What do you mean? He said, no. We offered him everything. Linda started the engine. Victor, Stanley doesn't want everything he wants. Justice, and justice in his mind, means watching Titan learn what it feels like to be disposable. That night, Stanley sat in his study composing his response to 3 more licensing inquiries, one from a startup in Brazil, working on sustainable agriculture, one from a research institute in Sweden developing autism therapy protocols, one from a coalition of African universities, building educational infrastructure. Each email was identical terms and conditions. Attached, licensing fee, $1 per organization, welcome to the future of collaborative innovation. But Stanley felt something different as he typed these responses, something that wasn't revenge or anger, but hope. His phone buzzed with a text from Julie. Saw the news about Linda's visit to your place. Dad, are you okay? Stanley looked out his window at the lights of Silicon Valley companies working late, developing solutions, competing, innovating, building the future he'd always imagined. He texted back, better than, okay, sweetheart. I think we're finally getting somewhere. Julie responded immediately, proud of you, Dad, for standing up for what's right. Stanley smiled as he hit send on the final licensing agreement of the day. Victor's offer had been Titan's last attempt to maintain control over the algorithm that built their empire. Stanley's rejection wasn't just a refusal to help, it was a declaration that the future of innovation belonged to innovators, not corporations that treated people as disposable resources. The war was entering its final phase, and Stanley was no longer just dismantling Titan's monopoly, he was building something better. By Friday morning, Titan's stock had dropped 60%, and trading was halted, pending a Securities Exchange investigation into unusual market activity. Linda, the boardroom, watching 17 executives argue about bankruptcy proceedings, emergency restructuring, and potential acquisitions, while Victor paced behind them, looking like a man watching his empire burn. We have 3 options, the chairman announced to the room. File for Chapter 11 protection, sell to one of our competitors, or find a way to regain exclusive control of the algorithm that built this company. Victor stopped pacing. The third option is impossible. Stanley Hoffman has made that clear. Charlotte had been right to resign early, Linda thought as she watched the board members who celebrated Titan's dominance just a month ago now, discussing which pieces of the company might be worth salvaging. Victor had spent the week threatening legal action that couldn't proceed, federal investigations that wouldn't materialize, and corporate warfare that had only accelerated their downfall. "What about the client contracts?" asked the CFO. "Surely we can maintain revenue from existing relationships even if we can't compete for new business." Linda shook her head. "We've lost 30% of our enterprise clients in 2 weeks. Companies that were exclusive Titan partners for years switching to Apex Dynamics, neural pathways, breakthrough AI." The irony wasn't lost on her that companies were leaving Titan for the same reason. Stanley had licensed his algorithm to competitors. They wanted innovation, not market domination, collaboration, not corporate control. Stanley had predicted this outcome when he'd refused her offer 3 days ago. Ethan knocked on the boardroom door, looking exhausted. "Linda, Victor, I have an update on the technical analysis." He entered carrying a laptop and what looked like weeks of documentation. "I've been trying to reverse engineer Stanley implementation to understand how the licensed versions work." Victor leaned over Ethan's shoulder. "Can we block them somehow? Disable their access? Degrade their performance?" Ethan shook his head. "That's not how this works, Victor. Stanley didn't steal our algorithm, he licensed his own algorithm. The one he built before Titan existed, the one our entire platform is based on." The room fell silent as the implications settled over them. Stanley hadn't taken something that belonged to Titan. Titan had been built on something that belonged to Stanley, and now Stanley was sharing his creation with anyone who wanted to innovate with it. "So what you're telling us," said the chairman slowly, "is that Titan doesn't actually own the core technology that makes Titan valuable." Ethan nodded. "Stanley retained intellectual property rights to his foundational work. Our legal agreements were written when we were a startup and nobody imagined this scenario." Linda felt the last piece of her strategy crumble. "How many companies have access to Stanley's algorithm now?" Ethan consulted his notes. 23 confirmed, with inquiries coming in daily from 6 continents. Stanley's not just licensing to direct competitors. He's enabling entire industries to develop AI capabilities. The CFO looked up from his calculator. 23 companies at $1 each means Stanley has made $23 from destroying a $2.8 billion company. Victor laughed bitterly. "He's not doing this for money. He's doing this to prove a point about corporate greed and disposable employees." By noon, the news had leaked to the financial press. Titan shares suspended amid algorithm controversy. Former employee allegedly licenses core technology to competitors. Stock analysts were calling it the most dramatic corporate implosion in Silicon Valley history. Linda's phone buzzed with calls from investors, reporters, crisis management firms, and headhunters who smelled opportunity in Titan's collapse. She ignored them all and drove to Stanley's apartment, hoping for one last conversation, one final attempt to find a solution that didn't end with Titan's complete destruction. Stanley wasn't home. His neighbor mentioned seeing him leave that morning with a suitcase and a laptop, headed somewhere in an Uber. Linda sat in her car outside his building, realizing that Stanley had moved beyond revenge into something that looked like victory. Her phone rang. It was Caleb Morrison from Neural Pathways. "Linda, I wanted to call before you heard it from the press. We're announcing a partnership with Breakthrough AI, Apex Dynamics, and 4 other companies to form an open innovation consortium for AI development." Linda felt something break inside her chest. "Using Stanley's algorithm." Caleb's voice was respectful but firm. "Using the algorithm Stanley licensed to us." "Yes, we're calling it the Atlas Consortium, after Stanley's original project. Name, we want to ensure that AI development serves humanity, corporate monopolies." "And Stanley?" Linda asked. "Stanley will serve as our chief innovation advisor. He's moving to Austin next week to help us build a collaborative research campus. where companies can work together instead of hoarding technology. Linda hung up the phone and stared at Stanley's empty apartment building. Victor called an hour later. The board voted Linda. We're filing for bankruptcy protection on Monday. The company will be dissolved and assets sold to cover debts. Linda wasn't surprised. What about the employees? Victor, thousands of people are going to lose their jobs. Atlas Consortium has offered positions to most of our technical staff. Stanley specifically requested that we provide them with job placement assistance and transition support. Victor's voice was hollow. He's taking care of our people better than we did. That evening, Linda sat in her office cleaning out her desk, while building security waited to escort her out. Titan's headquarters would be empty. By next Friday, the servers would be shut down. The research labs dismantled the corporate empire that Stanley built, reduced to bankruptcy, filings, and asset sales. She found a photo from Titan's first year. Stanley, Ethan, Victor herself, and 6 other employees, celebrating their first major client contract. They looked so young, so optimistic, so certain. They were building something that would change the world. They had changed the world. Linda realized, just not the way they'd expected. Stanley hadn't destroyed Titan. He'd liberated the innovation that Titan had been hoarding for a decade. Now that innovation belonged to everyone, and the future looked brighter because of it. As she walked out of the building for the last time, Linda wondered if Stanley would forgive them for forgetting companies are made of people, and people deserve better than being treated as disposable resources. The lights went out behind her, and Titan's 10-year dominance of the AI industry officially ended. Stanley stood on the roof deck of the Atlas Consortium's Austin headquarters, watching the sunset paint the hill country in shades of gold and crimson. 6 months had passed since Titan's collapse, and the consortium now included 37 companies from 19 countries, all working together to develop AI solutions for humanity's biggest challenges. Julie had visited the week before, marveling at the collaborative atmosphere, where engineers from competing companies shared research space, where open-source principles guided development, where profit motive was balanced with social responsibility. "Dad, this is what you always wanted to build, isn't it?" Stanley had nodded, watching a team from Breakthrough AI work, alongside researchers from Apex Dynamics, on a climate modeling project that neither company could have developed alone. This is what innovation looks like when it's not constrained by corporate hoarding or market monopolization. The Atlas algorithm had evolved far beyond Stanley's original design, enhanced by contributions from dozens of brilliant minds working in genuine collaboration. The consortium had developed applications Stanley never imagined: autism therapy protocols, environmental monitoring systems, educational platforms that adapted to individual learning. Still, as Caleb joined Stanley on the roof deck, carrying 2 cups of coffee, the Brazilian agriculture project, launched yesterday. Stanley crop yield predictions accurate to within 3%. Farmers are calling it revolutionary. Stanley smiled. Revolution seems to be our specialty. Any regret about Titan? Caleb asked. Stanley considered the question he'd been asked, variations of it, dozens of times by reporters, investors, former colleagues. "I regret that it took so long to realize that hoarding innovation serves no one. Titan could have been collaborative, innovative. Instead, it became a monument to corporate control." His phone buzzed with a message from Charlotte, who'd joined the consortium as chief legal officer after Titan's bankruptcy. "Stanley, the Stanford research team wants to interview you for their study on corporate ethics and innovation intact. You've become a case study in principled resistance to corporate abuse." Stanley showed Caleb the message. "I'm not sure I want to be a case study." Caleb laughed. "Stanley, you licensed a $28 billion algorithm for $1 each to 37 companies, and created the largest collaborative AI research consortium in history. You're definitely going to be a case study." The next morning, Stanley was in his lab working on a new project with Ethan, who'd joined the consortium after Titan's collapse. Ethan had grown during the past 6 months, from a naive prodigy, thoughtful engineer who understood that technology serves people, not the other way around. Stanley, I've been thinking about something, Ethan said, looking up from his code. When Titan fired you, Victor said, the company was evolving toward open source innovation. He was right, but not in the way he imagined. Stanley nodded. Victor wanted open source innovation that he could control. Titan wanted to set the standards, dominate the ecosystem, maintain monopolistic power. Instead, you gave us actual open source innovation, collaborative development, shared resources, genuine competition. Ethan smiled. Victor wanted to own the future. You decided to give it away. Stanley considered this. Ethan, I didn't give the future away. I gave it back. The future belongs to everyone, not to corporations that treat people as disposable. That afternoon, Stanley received an unexpected visitor. Ariana Torres, journalist, who'd been covering Titan's collapse, sat in his office with a notebook and recording device. Mr. Hoffman, I've been investigating the Titan story for 6 months, and I have to ask, was this always your plan? Stanley leaned back in his chair. Ariana, when I was fired from Titan, I felt erased, dismissed, invisible. I had 2 choices: become bitter and destructive, or choose where to place my loyalty and energy. I chose innovation over revenge, collaboration over competition, the future over the past. But you must have known that licensing your algorithm would destroy Titan. Ariana pressed. Stanley shook his head. I knew it would destroy Titan's monopoly. I hoped it would create something better, and it has. The Atlas Consortium has developed AI applications that Titan never would have created, because Titan was focused on market domination, not human benefit. Ariana scribbled notes. This wasn't revenge. Stanley was quiet for a moment. Ariana, revenge implies wanting to hurt someone for hurting you. I never wanted to hurt Victor or Linda or anyone at Titan. I wanted to ensure that my life's work served innovation instead of corporate greed. And now, 6 months later, do you think you succeeded? Ariana asked. Stanley gestured toward the window overlooking the Consortium campus, where researchers from around the world were collaborating on projects that would benefit millions of people. Ariana, 6 months ago, one company controlled AI innovation that could revolutionize healthcare, education, agriculture, climate science. Today, 37 companies are working together to solve humanity's biggest challenges, using technology that belongs to everyone. Stanley smiled. I'd say we've succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. That evening, Stanley sat in his Austin apartment, video calling with Julie, who was finishing her MBA at Wharton. Dad, the business school is teaching a case study about what you did. They're calling it the Hoffman model of principled innovation. Resistance. Stanley laughed. I'm not sure I like being a model of anything, Julie. I just made choices based on my values and refused to let corporate bullies erase me from the work I'd done. Julie's expression grew serious. Dad, you've shown an entire industry that people matter more than profit, that innovation belongs to innovators, not corporations. What are you working on next, Dad? Julie asked. Stanley looked at his laptop, displaying emails from researchers in Africa, Asia, South America, all requesting collaboration on projects that would bring AI benefits to underserved communities. We're launching the Global Innovation Initiative, Julie, bringing Atlas Consortium resources to developing nations. More revolution, Julie teased. Stanley smiled. More collaboration, Julie, more innovation, more proof that the future belongs to everyone, not just to corporations, wealthy enough to hoard it. As they said goodbye, Stanley felt something he hadn't experienced in years. At Titan, genuine pride in work that served humanity instead of corporate shareholders. The transformation was complete. Stanley had evolved from corporate architect to innovation liberator. Titan's collapse had been painful, but necessary, and the Atlas Consortium represented everything Stanley had always believed. Technology could become collaborative, ethical, innovative, and focused on human benefit. The algorithm that had built a monopoly now powered a revolution, and Stanley Hoffman, the quiet man who'd been dismissed as disposable, had become the architect of AI democracy. The future looked brighter because he'd chosen principles of profit, integrity, over compliance, collaboration, over control. Outside his window, Austin sparkled with the lights of companies working together instead of against each other, and Stanley knew that somewhere in Silicon Valley the lights of innovation were burning brighter because he'd refused to let corporate greed extinguish them. 2 years after Titan's collapse, Stanley stood at the podium of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, looking out at an audience of CEOs, government ministers and technology leaders, who had gathered to hear about what the Financial Times was calling the Atlas Revolution, the transformation of competitive AI development into collaborative innovation that was reshaping entire industries. The introduction felt surreal. Stanley Hoffman, former AI architect at Titan Technologies, now Chief Innovation Officer of the Atlas Consortium, will discuss how principal resistance to corporate monopolization can create more ethical and effective technological development. Stanley had never imagined that being fired from a job would lead to addressing world leaders about the future of innovation. 2 years ago, Stanley began, "I was terminated from a company I had helped build because my commitment to collaborative innovation conflicted with corporate desires for market monopolization. Today, that company no longer exists, and the algorithm they tried to control now powers 43 organizations across 6 continents working together to solve humanity's pressing challenges." He clicked to his first slide, showing a map of Atlas Consortium members' research labs in Singapore, developing water purification systems, universities in Nigeria, creating educational platforms, startups in Chile building climate monitoring networks, established companies Germany, designing accessibility technologies, all connected through Stanley's original algorithm, now evolved far beyond anything Titan had imagined. The Atlas Consortium represents more than technological collaboration, Stanley continued. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about collaborative innovation ownership. When brilliant minds work together without artificial constraints of corporate competition, the results exceed what any single organization could achieve alone. In the audience, Stanley spotted faces. He recognized Caleb Morrison, now CEO of the consortium's healthcare division, Ethan, who had become a leading voice in ethical AI development, Charlotte, who had helped establish the consortium's legal framework for collaborative intellectual property, Ariano Torres, whose reporting on the Titan collapse had become a Harvard Business School case study on corporate accountability. What Stanley didn't see were faces from Titan's old leadership. Victor had disappeared from the tech industry entirely. Some said he was teaching business ethics at a small college in Oregon. Others claimed he was writing a book about corporate hubris. Linda had joined a venture capital firm, focused on sustainable technology investments, but rarely appeared at industry events. Stanley advanced to his next slide, showing comparative innovation metrics. In Titan's final year as a monopolistic entity, they developed 3 new AI applications, all focused on expanding market dominance in the same period. The Atlas Consortium has developed 27 applications, focused on solving problems in healthcare, education, environmental protection, accessibility, and economic development. The audience murmured approvingly, but Stanley wasn't finished. More importantly, these applications are freely available to any organization committed to ethical use. The malaria prediction system developed by our Kenyan partners is being used by health ministries across Africa. The education accessibility platform created by our Swedish team is available to schools worldwide. The agricultural optimization system, built by our Brazilian colleagues, is helping farmers from India to Iowa. After his presentation, Stanley was approached by delegates from dozens of countries interested in joining the consortium. The European Union wanted to establish an Atlas Research Center focused on climate technology. The African Union was proposing a continental AI development initiative based on the Atlas model. Governments from Canada to Australia were inquiring about public-private partnership that could bring collaborative innovation to national challenges. During the cocktail reception, Stanley found himself in conversation with the Secretary General of the United Nations. Mr. Hoffman, the Atlas model represents exactly the kind of international cooperation we need to address global challenges. Would the consortium consider partnering with UN agencies on humanitarian applications? Stanley nodded, thoughtfully. Secretary General, the consortium's founding principle is that innovation should serve humanity, not corporate profit. We would be honored to explore partnerships that advance that mission. The conversation continued for an hour, covering possibilities for AI applications in refugee assistance, disaster response, poverty alleviation, and sustainable development. Later that evening in his hotel room, Stanley video called Julie, who was now finishing her first year as product manager at a renewable energy startup in San Francisco. "Dad, I watched your speech online. You looked comfortable up there. Like you belonged," Stanley laughed. "I felt like an imposter, Julie. 2 years ago, I was unemployed and angry. Today I'm supposedly a thought leader in collaborative innovation." "Dad, you didn't become a thought leader. You became a thought leader. You've been advocating for collaborative innovation your entire career. It just took the rest of the world a while to catch up." Julie paused. "Mom would be proud of what you've built. She always said you cared more about doing the right thing than making money." Stanley felt a familiar pang, thinking about his late wife Margaret, who had died 3 years before Titan's collapse. Margaret had been his moral compass during the darkest days of corporate politics, reminding him that his work had purpose beyond profit margins. She would have understood his decision to license the algorithm for $1. She would have supported his choice to prioritize principles over paychecks. The next morning Stanley received a call from Patricia, his lawyer. "Stanley, you're not going to believe this, but Victor Dane wants to meet with you. He's in Davos for some consulting conference, and he requested a conversation." Stanley was quiet for a long moment. He hadn't spoken to Victor since the day he was fired, hadn't thought about him much during the past 2 years of building something better. "Did he say what he wanted to discuss?" Stanley asked. Patricia laughed. "He said he wanted to apologize and ask for advice. Apparently, he's writing a book about leadership failures and corporate accountability." Stanley considered this. It would be easy to refuse to maintain the distance he'd created between his new life and the toxic environment Victor had represented, but Stanley had learned that healing sometimes required facing the people who had caused harm, not for their benefit, but for his own closure. "Tell him I'll meet him for breakfast tomorrow at my hotel. 1 hour, no recording devices, no lawyers, just 2 people talking about choices and consequences." The next morning Victor walked into the hotel restaurant, looking older than his 52 years. His signature navy suits had been replaced by casual clothes, his confident corporate demeanor replaced by something that looked like humility. He approached Stanley's table hesitantly as if unsure of his welcome. "Stanley, thank you for agreeing to see me," Victor said, sitting down across from him. "I wasn't sure you would." Stanley poured coffee for both of them. "Victor, 2 years ago I wouldn't have, but I've learned that anger is a heavy thing to carry. I'm not interested in carrying it anymore." Victor nodded. "Stanley, I owe you an apology for how I handled your termination, for the way I treated you, for prioritizing corporate control over human decency. You built something beautiful and I tried to turn it into a weapon for market domination." Listened without interrupting, letting Victor continue. "After Titan collapsed, I had a lot of time to think about leadership, about the difference between managing resources and managing people, about the cost of treating employees as disposable." Victor paused. "Stanley, you were never disposable. We're the heart of everything we built, and I was too arrogant to see it." Stanley considered Victor's words. They sounded genuine, but Stanley had heard corporate apologies before, carefully crafted statements designed to manage perception rather than acknowledge responsibility. "Victor, what do you want from this conversation?" Stanley asked directly. Victor pulled out a notebook. "I'm writing a book about corporate leadership failures, about what happens when companies lose sight of their human foundation. I want to include our story, but I want to get it right. I want to understand how my decisions led to Titan's collapse and your success." Stanley leaned back in his chair. "Victor, You want to understand how treating people as disposable resources led to the collapse of a company built by those same people. Victor nodded. I know it sounds obvious when you say it like that, but at the time I thought I was making smart business decisions. Victor, you thought you were consolidating power. Stanley said. You thought that controlling the algorithm meant controlling the market. You thought that removing me would give you more flexibility to exploit Titan's monopoly. What you didn't understand is monopolies built on exploitation are inherently unstable. Victor scribbled notes. So when you licensed the algorithm to competitors, you weren't just getting revenge. You were demonstrating the instability of our business model. Stanley shook his head. Victor, I wasn't demonstrating anything, choosing where to place my loyalty and energy after being betrayed by people I trusted. And you chose innovation over revenge, Victor said. Stanley corrected him. I chose collaboration over control. I chose principles over profit. I chose to build something better rather than destroy something broken. Victor wrote frantically, trying to capture Stanley's words. What would you have done differently, Victor, if you could go back? Stanley asked. Victor was quiet for a long time. I would have listened to you about collaborative innovation. I would have treated employees as partners, not resources. I would have focused on building solutions instead of building monopolies. Stanley nodded. Victor, those weren't business decisions. They were moral decisions. And moral decisions reveal character. The Atlas Consortium works because it's built on trust, respect, and shared purpose. Titan failed because it was built on control, exploitation, and individual ambition. They talked for 2 hours, Victor, asking questions about leadership ethics, the consortium's structure, the principles that guided collaborative innovation. Stanley answered honestly, not because he owed Victor anything, but because conversation helped him understand his own journey from corporate victim to innovation leader. As they prepared to leave, Victor asked one final question. Stanley, do you think redemption is possible for someone like me, someone who made decisions based on power rather than principles? Stanley considered this. Victor, redemption isn't something you achieve, it's something you practice every day, through choices that prioritize people over profit, principles over convenience. The Atlas Consortium has a consulting division that helps organizations transition from competitive to collaborative models. Stanley continued, if you're serious about understanding ethical leadership rather than just writing about it, there might be opportunities to contribute to something constructive. Victor's eyes widened. You would consider working with me, after everything that happened? Stanley smiled. Victor, I'm not working with the person who fired me. I'm considering working with the person you're choosing to become. That's the difference between punishment and transformation. After Victor left, Stanley walked through Davos thinking about forgiveness, accountability, and the long arc of justice. His phone buzzed with messages from consortium members around the world reporting breakthrough developments. The Kenyan malaria prediction system had achieved 94% accuracy. The Swedish accessibility platform was being implemented in 40 countries. The Brazilian agricultural system was helping farmers increase yields while reducing environmental impact. Each success felt like vindication, not of Stanley's revenge against Titan, but of his belief that innovation thrived when brilliant minds collaborated, rather than competed. The algorithm that had once powered a monopoly enabled global cooperation on humanity's biggest challenges. That afternoon, Stanley received an unexpected call from Linda Chen. Stanley, I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I saw your speech at Davos and I wanted to congratulate you on what you've built. Stanley was surprised to hear from her, but not uncomfortable. The anger that had once defined his feelings about Titan's leadership had been replaced by something closer to pity. Linda, how are you doing? Stanley asked, genuinely curious about her life after Titan. I'm working in sustainable technology investment now, trying to fund innovation that serves social good rather than just generate profit. She paused. Stanley, I've learned a lot about leadership from watching what you built after we destroyed what you had built. You didn't destroy what I built, Linda, Stanley said. You revealed that what I thought we were building was different from what Victor wanted to control. My algorithm survived Titan's collapse. because it was never really Titan's algorithm. It was always meant to serve innovation, not corporate monopolization. Linda was quiet for a moment. Stanley, I need to ask you something. After Titan collapsed, I felt like a failure, like everything I had worked for was meaningless. How did you find the strength to build something new after being so thoroughly rejected? Stanley walked to his hotel window overlooking the Swiss Alps, thinking about the question that had defined his transformation. Linda, I found strength in remembering why I became an engineer in the first place, to solve problems, to create solutions, to make life better for people. When Titan fired me, they reminded me that my purpose was never about serving corporate interests, it was about serving human needs. The Atlas Consortium works because everyone involved remembers that technology serves humanity, not the other way around. Stanley continued, when your purpose is clear, your path becomes clear, even when that path leads through corporate betrayal and professional rejection. Linda thanked him for the conversation and promised to stay in touch. Stanley hoped she would. The Linda he remembered from Titan's early days had been passionate about innovation before corporate pressures had twisted that passion into something more about control than creation. That evening, Stanley attended a dinner hosted by the World Economic Forum for technology leaders. The conversation ranged across artificial intelligence, climate change, economic inequality, and global cooperation, topics that would have been discussed very differently when corporate monopolies dominated technological development. Sitting next to Stanley was the director of a research institute in Ghana, who was using Atlas Consortium algorithms to develop educational technology for rural communities. Mr. Hoffman, your decision to open source the Titan algorithm has created opportunities for innovation in parts of the world that were previously excluded from technological development. Across the table, the Minister of Technology from Singapore was describing how consortium partnerships had accelerated their smart city initiatives. The collaborative model allows us to implement solutions developed by partners in Brazil, Kenya, Sweden, and adapt them to our local needs, rather than starting from scratch or paying monopolistic licensing fees. Stanley listened to these conversations with deep satisfaction, not because he was being praised, but because the vision he had carried for decades was finally being realized. Technology was serving humanity rather than corporate shareholders. Innovation was flowing freely, rather than being hoarded for competitive advantage. Brilliant minds were collaborating, rather than competing. After dinner, Stanley walked through Davos streets, thinking about the journey that had brought him from a corporate termination letter to a global platform for discussing collaborative innovation. 2 years ago, he had been invisible, erased from the company he helped build today. He was helping reshape how the world thought about technology ownership and innovation ethics. He called Caleb, who was back in Austin managing the consortium's day-to-day operations. Caleb, the response here has been incredible. Governments, universities, research institutes all want to explore Atlas partnerships. Caleb laughed. Stanley, we're going to need to expand faster than we planned. The infrastructure for global collaboration is more complex than we anticipated. Good problems to have, Stanley said. Caleb, remember when we started this, we hoped to prove that collaborative innovation could work. Now we're proving that it works better than competitive monopolization ever did. Caleb agreed. Stanley, the consortium has developed more breakthrough applications in 2 years than Titan developed in its entire 10-year existence. The next morning, Stanley prepared to leave Davos with commitments from 12 countries to establish Atlas research centers, partnerships with international organizations, and funding pledges that would support collaborative innovation projects for the next decade. His final meeting was with a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of Titan's collapse and the Atlas Consortium's rise. Mr. Hoffman, your story represents a fundamental shift in how we think about corporate power, individual agency, and the relationship between innovation and ethics. Stanley considered the proposal. If you want to tell this story, it should focus on the principles that guide collaborative innovation rather than the personalities involved. This isn't about Stanley Hoffman versus Victor Dane. It's about cooperation versus control ethics versus exploitation principles versus profit. The filmmaker nodded, but personal stories help people understand larger principles. Your decision to license the algorithm for $1 each, rather than destroy it, or sell it for millions, that choice reveals something important about character and values. Stanley smiled. Then tell the story of everyone involved in building the Atlas Consortium, the engineers in Kenya, developing malaria prediction systems, the researchers, in Sweden, accessibility platforms, the farmers in Brazil, optimizing agricultural yields through AI. Their stories matter more than mine. As Stanley boarded his flight back to Austin, he reflected on how completely his life had changed in 2 years, from unemployed engineer to global thought leader. From corporate victim to innovation architect, from someone whose contributions were erased to someone whose principles were reshaping an industry. But the most important change wasn't professional, it was personal. Stanley had learned that integrity wasn't about avoiding compromise, it was about choosing principles to compromise for, and which principles to defend, regardless of personal cost. He had learned that loyalty wasn't about blind support for organizations that employed him, it was about faithful commitment to values that guided him. The Atlas Consortium had succeeded, not because Stanley was particularly brilliant or visionary, but because he had refused to let corporate betrayal corrupt his commitment to collaborative innovation. The algorithm that had built a monopoly was now building a movement toward more ethical, more effective, more humane, technological development. As the plane lifted off from Zurich, Stanley opened his laptop to review partnership proposals from the United Nations, World Health Organization, and dozens of governments around the world. Each proposal represented opportunities to apply collaborative innovation to challenges that affected millions of people. Phone buzzed with a message from Julie. Dad saw the news coverage of your Davos speech, trending globally. Atlas Revolution. People are calling you the architect of ethical AI. Stanley smiled and typed back. The real architects are the thousands of people choosing collaboration over competition, ethics over exploitation every day. Looking out the airplane window at the European landscape below, Stanley thought about Margaret, and what she would say about the journey that had brought him from corporate termination to global recognition. She would probably remind him that recognition wasn't the goal, that serving humanity was its own reward, that building something beautiful was more important than being acknowledged for building it. The Atlas algorithm had evolved far beyond Stanley's original design, shaped by contributions from brilliant minds around the world, but its core purpose remained unchanged: to serve innovation, rather than monopolization, to enable collaboration, rather than control, to prove that technology could make life better for everyone, not just more profitable for corporations. Titan's collapse had been painful, but necessary. The company had lost sight of its founding purpose, becoming focused on market domination rather than problem solving. Victor and Linda had chosen power over principles, control over collaboration, and their choices had revealed the instability of systems built on exploitation. Stanley's choice had been different, not because he was morally superior to his former colleagues, but because he had remembered why he became an engineer in the first place: to create solutions, to solve problems, to make life better through technology. The Atlas Consortium worked because everyone involved shared that fundamental commitment. As the plane began descent toward Austin, Stanley felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death: complete alignment between his values and his work, between his principles and his daily choices, between his vision of what technology could accomplish and the reality of what technology was accomplishing. Atlas Consortium represented more than a business model or a technology platform. It represented proof that collaborative innovation could create better solutions than competitive monopolization, that treating people as partners rather than resources led to better outcomes, that choosing principle over profit was not only morally right, but practically effective. Stanley's algorithm had built an empire that forgot its humanity, and then helped birth a movement that remembered it. The legacy would not be the collapse of Titan Technologies, but the rise of collaborative innovation as a force for global good, the quiet revolution that began with 12 $1 licensing agreements had become a transformation of how the world approached technological development. Stepping off the plane in Austin, Stanley saw the skyline of a city that had become the heart of collaborative innovation. Companies that had once competed against each other now worked together to solve humanity's biggest challenges, where the algorithm that had once served corporate monopolization now powered global cooperation. The future looked brighter because thousands of brilliant minds were working together rather than against each other, because innovation was flowing freely rather than being hoarded for competitive advantage, because technology was serving humanity rather than corporate shareholders. Stanley Hoffman had been erased from one story only to become the author of a much better one. Best part was that this story was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.